All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, February 16th of 2022. It is NBA All-Star Break Eve, kind of, sort of. 2 slates left, I think, before the All-Star Break hits this weekend here. So quite a few interesting questions in our queue here for today already. Going to bounce around a little bit. We'll answer questions in about the same order I got them here, but a couple interesting questions about late swap that I want to start with. We'll move around a little bit, but some good questions overall. As always, if you have questions for me, go ahead and pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack or into the YouTube chat, and we'll answer questions here. Before we go ahead and get into things here today, wanted to mention that tomorrow we'll be doing something a little bit different. We'll be, first of all, pushing office hours an hour back, so we'll be 3 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, but we're going to be having a special guest here on us on stream tomorrow to talk a little bit of NASCAR DFS strategy. So as I have mentioned on stream here a bunch over the past couple weeks, the models team here is working really hard on getting our new NASCAR sims up and ready for Daytona this weekend. We expect to have it ready for use for Daytona this weekend. I know there's a DraftKings Millie. There's some big contests for Daytona. And in kind of to celebrate, I guess, the release of that NASCAR sim and to get everybody ready, myself included, for some NASCAR DFS, I'll be interviewing, I guess, one of our better NASCAR DFS players in our community here tomorrow on stream, learning a little bit myself here about how to crush NASCAR DFS. So if you have questions about NASCAR, go ahead, I guess, over the next 24 hours or so, just start popping them into the Office Hours channel in Slack. If you watch this later or you're not in Slack, you can also email us, support@sabersim.com. Let us know what questions you have. Tomorrow, we'll be focusing really on kind of higher level NASCAR strategy, not necessarily so much breaking out SaberSim and walking through a build, but just kind of what are we looking for in this sport? What are the strategies? What does our research process look like? And then we'll be doing more content through the end of the week this week and next week to kind of kick off the start of NASCAR season. So very excited about that. But in the meantime here, let's go ahead and get some questions going here. And we will start with a question, a couple questions, I guess, from Brendan here. And I know there are some other questions that came in before this. Again, I'm going to bounce around a little bit, but I'm going to start here because I think this is a good question to kick the stream off with. So this one says, when are the most critical times to enter late swaps? Do late swaps become less valuable as the night progresses or more valuable? Please note if the answer varies between main and other slates. Thank you. Yeah, good question here. I think there's a couple different ways to unpack this one or to kind of talk about different things here. And the first is that, you have the maximum amount of leverage in your lineup, right? The maximum ability or flexibility to late swap the earlier in the slate that news breaks, right? If we get significant news about any game really at the 5:30 lock time here, we have the most ability at that particular point to affect our lineups to optimize for it, right? As the slate goes on and more players get locked into your positions in your lineups, right? That means you have less and less ability to swap optimally for breaking news. So from that standpoint, I think some of the most important swaps to do would, in theory, be the earlier swaps in the night. However, the problem with that is that because this is only 30 minutes after lock, a lot of times you have a situation where we know the information about these games at lock, or there are enough players that just finished building their lineups at 5 that at 5:15, when we get news about the 5:30 games, they're still around and the field swaps optimally as well. So compare that with, sometimes in these later games, the 8 o'clock games, there are a lot of situations where news breaks that, maybe because people are tired at that point, or they're not paying attention anymore, or they just don't bother, right? News that, maybe 70% of the field would have swapped for at 5:30, maybe you only get 20% of the field swapping for at 8, right? Now you balance that again with, how much late swap flexibility you have in your lineups. And I think there's an interesting kind of push and pull of where you can actually get the most return on swapping compared to what the field is doing, compared to how much flexibility you have in your lineups, and Yeah, I guess really, mostly those two things. I think all in all, I don't think there's anything that I would say is necessarily actionable from this beyond making sure that you are late swapping every time you should be anyway, right? I don't think the lesson here is that, if you have late swapped at 5:30, you don't have to at 8, or vice versa, that you don't have to late swap at 5:30 if you are counting on a late swap at 8 or anything like that. I typically, here's what I generally try to do myself, is that anytime there is news that breaks that affects the projections, right? Player is ruled out, players starting that wasn't expected, whatever the variety of different things that can happen on an NBA slate are, right? I try to late swap to account for that news as early as possible, generally so that I have as much flexibility in the lineups to account for it. And I will do that each time that news comes out, right? So, if we get news about the 8 o'clock games at 5:30, I will swap at 5:30 to have as much flexibility as possible. And then if there's more news at 8, I'll swap again. So I do think at the end of the day, it's kind of an interesting relationship here between how much flexibility do you have in your lineups, right? And to be able to swap to certain things. And then also how much is the field swapping? Because I have noticed that, the later in the slate that news breaks, the less of the field, even beyond just the salary flexibility thing. Like there's legitimately a sense of the field is swapping less to adjust more as the slate progresses. So I think from an ownership standpoint, from gaining an edge that way, you do get a little bit more of an advantage as the slate goes on. So, but interesting little question to start things off here. And then there was a kind of a follow-up here. I'm just going to hit the rest of Brendan's questions here, and then we'll keep it moving. This one says, what's the next SaberSim function to learn after one feels comfortable late swapping? It's an interesting question. I don't know if I would necessarily position things that way. I think part of the situation here right now, just given the time of the year that it is, with NBA being kind of our primary main sport, is that I come on here, a lot of times I come on and talk about late swap, and there's questions about late swap, and we answer questions about late swap, and we demo late swap, because in NBA, I've mentioned it countless times here, I feel like that is the single biggest edge you can get, right? So I don't know. I mean, frankly, there are a lot of slates where I come in and really want to, maybe the only value add kind of thing that I do to my lineups at all is late swapping. When we get to baseball season, I think I could see us talking a little bit more about maybe some exposure editing, maybe dive back into the research builds kinds of things a little bit more. I don't know if there is a skill so much that I would say that is like the next one to learn after late swap. If there's something, if there's something in the software that you are interested in or confused by, I'm happy to kind of give a little bit of a demo about any particular part of the process. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think what probably makes more sense is to kind of, I think, come back to, a little bit more first principles of the sport that you're interested in playing, and maybe the easiest way to do that is to, head back over to our YouTube channel, watch some of our intro videos. And I know Brendan in particular, you've watched a bunch of these, but, kind of start our goal with, for example, the 4 keys to beating NBA DFS is to kind of explain the core principles of what it takes to beat the sport. So if you watch this and there's kind of something in here, and I don't even remember exactly what all of these are, to be honest, but there's something in here like, oh, how do I do this thing that these guys are talking about? Then we can talk about the tools that are, available in the app to do that, or the ways that those things are already automated in the app to do that. So yeah, but interesting question there. And let's see. And then a good question and kind of a relevant question, a chronologically relevant question, I guess, so to speak here. And this one is, are there any changes / patterns that occur after the All-Star break or during play-ins, playoffs of which SaberSim users should take note? Yeah, there definitely are. I would say the biggest thing after the All-Star break that you will notice, especially as we approach the playoffs, is that rotations and injuries and late scratches and things like that can get far more unpredictable. So I would say If it already felt like it was too much late swapping, too much having to be around and ready to make changes for you playing NBA up until this point, it's only going to get crazier. I think with that, there is an edge that you can gain, right? If you have the diligence to swap every 30 minutes throughout a slate to account for all of that, especially as we move on, right? There's going to be slates where you've got like an entire team of G leaguers playing and everybody's min salary and right, it all opened up after lock, that kind of stuff. I think there's a big edge to be had there. The one other thing though, I will note, well, I guess there's two. Like the counterbalance of the fact that there's a greater edge in late swapping is that you have some attrition in terms of the contests at this point in the season. There is some fall off. Contests are going to get a little bit smaller. Typically, the sharpest players are the ones that remain. So your theoretical expected value or edge you have against your opponents, I think, goes down a little bit. It also inherently becomes a little bit of a higher variance game. It becomes a game that is a little bit harder to project, right? When we get to these slates that will inevitably happen here in March and even April, late February, March, April, right? And we have those, 5 guys that are starting that have not even played a single game together yet, right? Those situations at a baseline are harder to model. They are harder to project. There are situations, where the game becomes a little bit higher variance, right? There can be kind of, harder losses, but also, bigger wins when you're on the right side of that as well. So in terms of what is actionable there, I would say it probably makes sense to kind of increase your expectations of what might be required from a late swap standpoint, and potentially decrease your expectations of what might be possible, from a profitability standpoint. I play NBA all year long, but I do think it's worth kind of having those assumptions that the game might get a little bit sharper and also demand a little bit more of you to play optimally if you're late swapping and doing all the things you should be doing, because the rotations for teams and scratches and things like that, the teams that are eliminated or essentially eliminated really care more about losing than winning at that point. I think teams still have a fairly good reason to try to tank. The teams that are in the playoff hunt, I think in the NBA, I think part of the reason why this happens is basically what I'm explaining here. I think teams in the NBA in particular are a little bit more concerned with just making the playoffs in general than really trying to fight for the highest seed, right? Especially teams with more aging stars. The Nets, for example, who have basically struggled for like a month straight here with the team that they have, are going to be more concerned about just getting a seat at the table for the playoffs than trying to maximize their seed. And if that comes at the expense of James Harden sitting out certain games, or I guess James Harden no longer, right? If that comes at the expense of, Kyrie or Durant when he comes back, sitting out games to stay healthy throughout the playoffs, they will do that, which opens up value there. Come the playoff time, right? And I think maybe this actually might be deserving of an entirely separate stream. We did one last year. NBA playoffs are a little bit of a different beast. Rotations tighten, right? And you can get a little bit of an edge knowing what teams are playing for, right? Teams that went, lower seeds that went down 0-2 and are playing their first game at home in game 3, right? I think in general have the big incentive to win that game. And a lot of times you see the starters get a little bit more run in game 7s, right? You're going to see both teams get a little bit more run. It's not necessarily true. Teams get swept all the time, right? It's not necessarily true that the team down is always going to win game 3 or that this is 100% reliable. But I think if you're paying attention to the playoffs, right, specifically, and what is at stake in each game, I think there's a little bit of an edge to be had there by just understanding, who has more minutes upside. But also looking at, and we'll talk about this, there's another question about this here in a minute, but also who has minutes upside literally in their projection. Right? Like, let's just assume that this was a playoff game. And I don't think the Knicks, I wonder if the Knicks are even there. I think they are. But let's say this just was a playoff game, right? And you're looking at minutes projections, right? And again, these are not the real final kind of starting playoff rotations for these teams. But somebody like Julius Randle, right? There's only 48 minutes in the game. Like, there's a limit to how much higher his minutes projection could get, right? But, if we had Even somebody like Seth Curry's projected for 32 minutes. Well, if he was actually a 36-minute player in the playoffs, right, there's 4 extra minutes there. So looking at that kind of thing, looking at what teams have to play for, but also how much upside is available in their minutes projection, I think is pretty sharp and can be a pretty interesting way to get a little bit of an edge in playoff basketball. The one other thing I'll mention, and then we'll move on, and there's enough here that I'm just talking about right now that I'm thinking maybe this is deserving of a separate stream. But the one other thing I would look at is that there's a little bit of a coach chess game that happens in basketball playoff games. Rotations can change as the coaches kind of figure out the best way to match up against the opposing team. If you can get a sense, Max has talked about this on his streams before here of using popcorn machine and things like that to research rotations. If you can get a sense of how a team might play that is different to match up against the other team better, even over the course of a series, right? There's on one hand, there's like, oh, well, maybe one team plays small. How might the coach maybe deal with that in this game 1? But also as the series goes on, right? These teams have now played each other 6 times and you're going into a game 7. What has the coaching rotation matchup chess game looked like throughout this series? Is there a reason to believe that maybe, they're going to play smaller than normal? They're going to play bigger than normal, right? Maybe somebody that, typically comes off the bench, right? Maybe there's a team facing elimination in game 6, and somebody that doesn't play too many minutes off the bench typically now, has kind of that 6-man type role or something like that, right? Like that stuff, when teams are pushed to elimination, there you see that kind of stuff come out. There's an opportunity to get a little bit of an edge there. So, all very fun, all a lot to look forward to here. So enjoy the All-Star break. Get ready for some chaos, I guess, on the latter half of the regular season. And then I think NBA DFS in the playoffs is pretty fun. It is. I also, just because I guess it's not, I was going to say selfishly, it's not selfishly, but it's by far my favorite sport to watch. So I think it is just a blast to play DFS in the NBA playoffs. But anyway, let's go ahead. Let's keep it going here. Let's answer some more questions. I'm going to bounce up and hit some of these other questions here. I'm going to read this question first of all. This is kind of getting to a technical question here that I don't entirely know the answer to, but I'm gonna read the question. I'm gonna talk about this briefly, and then I'll probably end up asking Matt about this. But JDS Dog said, question about step 1 exposures. If you have player A with min exposure 20%, every time a lineup is produced during the build, it will first evaluate if player A has greater than 20% exposure in already produced lineups. And if that evaluation is false, it will force them into the next lineup. Is that correct? Yes, that is correct. If so, what happens if I have many players with exposure rules? If the evaluation is false for more players than it can fit into a lineup, how is this handled? I assume it tries to fit in as many players as possible that it evaluated false and move on to the next lineup and repeat. Is that correct? I think so. I think what happens here is that, let's say, for example, you have a minimum exposure set of, let's say you have min and max exposure set for every single player in the pool in step 1, right? I imagine, best case is what I can imagine here is that the pool of players that is available to be used in the next lineup that is built is limited to players for whom their exposures are not currently met. Their min exposures are not currently met. And vice versa, the players for whom their maximum exposure is already exceeded are excluded from that lineup. But there is an interesting technical question here, I think, of kind of like how this is done. And I'm not a developer. I didn't build this, so I don't know like rigorously or specifically how this is built. I think you in general have a good understanding of it. I will ask Matt for maybe a little bit more color on how this is handled. I think a lot of times too, when these kinds of questions come in, knowing why this question is being asked can sometimes be helpful, especially if there's a practical reason. If this is just curiosity, I'll follow up with Matt and see if there's anything I'm missing here. But JDS Dog, if you're watching here, if you're watching here and there's like there's something you're trying to do here, let me know. So, okay. And now I'm going to just rip through here the questions in Slack in roughly chronological order here. YouTube chat, I see you guys. We'll get to you in just a minute here. I want to get through Slack first. So first, Do you think in the future it would be possible to bulk upload a set of exposures into the late swap editor to serve as guidelines? For example, I like to use a certain formula for exposure, so those exposures may change based off late news just because of the nature of my formula. Currently, I don't think there's any way to change the previous exposures I set in bulk so that the entry editor respects them. We know that the entry editor is kind of, I don't want to say a mess. It is confusing because you can do the same things in the entry editor that you can do on step 1. But those two sections of the site don't really talk to one another, and they don't really, you can bulk upload exposures to step 1, but you can't do it here, right? So yes, the short answer is yes. We know that this is a bit of a pain point, and this is something that we're planning on improving in the future. I think the goal here would be, or like what we would hope to be able to do, is that anytime you are doing something that happens before a build, it all happens in this place, so that you could go in here and upload exposures, for example, and have them be honored in a late swap build. That is a kind of a big restructuring project for us, technically speaking, but it is on our radar. It's something that we are kind of actively brainstorming and talking about now. So we are aware that it's a bit of a point of confusion for people, or kind of a pain point, I guess. So. All right. Okay, a couple questions from JSJR here. I mentioned we would talk a little bit more about minutes. So, question says, what minutes should we aim for when picking players 5K and below? This is an interesting question. I'm going to start by saying, I don't know necessarily if doing research on the minutes projection for players is a great way to add value, mostly because it is already, naturally baked into the sim, right? It is really more descriptive of the simulations than it is predictive of upside, right? We are already taking into account the minutes projections come from the sims just the same way the average projections do. So if you are getting a player in your lineups, it stands to reason that they have enough projected minutes on the court in that particular simulation to justify their place in the lineup, right? And if they're not in the lineup, then one of the many reasons why they're not in the lineup could be that they don't play enough minutes. I do think the idea here, especially on smaller slates, of searching for minutes upside is interesting. So I would say I guess you can also look at it from a value standpoint, right? So let's do it from a value standpoint, right? And let's just compare these two players, right? Aaron Wiggins and Zach Collins, right? We're looking at two players in a vacuum. Right, they are both projected. Wiggins is close to 8x value. Zach Collins is close to 7x value. When you look at this minutes projection, right, Wiggins projects for 32 minutes. Zach Collins projects for 18 minutes, right? And they are projected for almost the exact same amount of fantasy points. Now, what this indicates to me is that there is a level of fragility to Aaron Wiggins' projection, right? If he gets 26 minutes, his projection is going to fall, right? There is a limit to how we are projecting him as we are projecting him to start and play a legitimate starter workload, right? There are players on the bench that occupy a similar load, right? Now, I think you could do some research and justify and feel confident and say, no, I've researched this. I do think Aaron Wiggins is going to play 32 minutes or more, right? But somebody like Zach Collins on the other side essentially projects for 7x value as long as he plays at least 18 minutes, right? Now, what happens if it's 24 minutes, right? It's almost saying like what is going to happen to the projection if we are wrong, right? Well, there's not a lot of room to be wrong on Zach Collins in a way that is negative to us, right? Yeah, I guess, he could play 10 minutes, right? But there are way more minutes he can play than minutes he could play less, right? Does that make sense? So I do think there's an interesting idea there that as you are doing your research, looking at the minutes projection to see, if we are wrong about this player from a rotational standpoint, what's going to happen to his projection, right? So that's one thing I've looked at. I think on smaller slates where you kind of need, I don't even know if it's so much smaller slates. I guess it can be smaller slates. I think we talked about this specifically for playoffs last year, right? Kind of, and I mentioned this on the playoffs question before, is that as you get to like these later playoff 2-3 game slates where the contests are big and you need to really kind of do something different, I think it can be kind of interesting to start to ask yourself, where is potential minutes upside, right? Where can you find a player that maybe, a player like, like Royce O'Neal is an interesting one, right? Who maybe projects as a decent value here, right? But what is going to happen if he what are the situations where he plays 36 minutes, and what do you even stand to gain out of that if that happens? Whereas, hypothetically, what if Kevon Looney gets 32 minutes, right? Who has more flexibility in its minutes projections to get there and does more on a point per minute basis anyway. So I think that's an interesting thing to check out there. Again, it's not a huge part of my process until we start to get to the playoffs and you have these kind of meteor contests for much smaller slates. The one other thing I'll note there before I move on is that there is minutes variance baked into the sim model anyway. So remember that, this is purely an average, and we understand that players have natural variance in how many minutes they play. But good question. So. All right. I see a couple quick questions. I'm going to just tackle these real quick because I see these questions coming in Slack. First of all, Eric Johnson said Aaron Wiggins sucks, though. I really don't want to play anyone from OKC on a slate this size. You don't have to. I think if you went in and built your 20 or 150 lineups for the main slate tonight, and you're probably seeing that you're getting all of the Aaron Wiggins, if you just uncheck him, you'll probably see that there's plenty of flexibility in your player pool to just omit him entirely if you want. Or better yet, just cross him off from step one, right? So David said the green download button on step 3 can be confusing at times. What is the reason for it being there? There are times when I've made a build and clicked that button rather than going to entries. We completely agree. That is something that is also probably planned to be moved because it is a green button that shows up and it's not really what we actually want you to do, right? The actual thing that you're supposed to do is go to the entries tab and fill and then download. So that's something that we're planning on changing as well. But yeah. No, I totally understand. He said, and then it tried to upload to FanDuel or DraftKings and it doesn't work. Yep. No, I know it is confusing. It's something that we're planning on changing. So DOBO says, do you ever cover hockey? If not, which videos or gurus out there can help out? I'd recommend starting here. I am not a huge NHL DFS guru. I guess I've been playing more and more of it this season. I'm trying to get more familiar with the sport. But I did recently, at the start of the hockey season, have a couple people that are NHL DFS gurus come on and show me the light. And that video is right here on our YouTube channel under the How to Beat NHL DFS section. We had Mr. Clean and Couch from our community come in, talk to me for almost an hour and a half about hockey strategy, how to use SaberSim. So I'd start here. I'd watch this video. There is also a good video from Max a little over a year ago now, shorter video, where he kind of talks about, a little bit more quick hitter strategy for NHL. But this is the more recent video. I think this is a more effective video to start with. So, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to always chat a little bit of hockey on here. I definitely don't want to give the indication that I'm an NHL expert, but I'm happy to talk about what you guys want to talk about. So Eric said, we're all going to play NHL next week when NBA is down. Lamau. Yeah, I am definitely planning on doing that. Three Putts was in here a couple weeks ago, and he told me that contest sizing on the NHL slates during the All-Star break gets a little bit better. So I'm excited to see that. I'm excited to see when DraftKings and FanDuel are pushed up against it here with no NFL and no NBA. Can they pull it together and give us a nice, decent sized NHL contest? Looking forward to seeing if they can get it done. But so Brad says, I'm so bad at NHL. I've had mixed success. It is a game that to me feels like it should play similar to MLB. I know that's the common comparison. And baseball is my best sport. So yeah, Eric, right there. I think NHL said, like MLB on ice. Yeah. So anyway, let's keep it going. Okay, this is an interesting question. We'll hit this one real quick. We'll keep going. All right. This question, JSJR, I'm having trouble with roster construction. What advice could you give me to consistently reach over 300 fantasy points nightly? To be completely honest, let's run a build here. That is, frankly, not really a sustainable outcome, actually. There really isn't a strategy that anyone could give you where you would score a certain amount of fantasy points across all of your lineups nightly, right? So like we can talk about this even mathematically, right? So let's go ahead. Let me pull this up, right? So if we take the middle outcome, right, the 50th percentile score for your lineups, right? That's what the 50th percentile is. It is essentially the middle outcome, right? And let's sort by projected score. And this is the kind of lineups that you would be running in a 20 max, 10 to 50K, right? When we say that this is the middle outcome, this is the 50th percentile, right? This means that if we played this slate out 10,000 times, there would, in theory, half the time this lineup would score less than this point, right? And half the time it would score more than this, right? So across a pool of 20 lineups, and the more and more lineups you have across a pool of 1,000 lineups, if you were to do this, right, your expectation on tonight's slate would probably, there's inter-lineup correlation at this point, but you would probably assume that half your lineups would score above their median and half their lineups would score below their median, right? If you want a lineup that's going to score 300 points, right, let's look at that. It's probably going to be something like a 75th percentile outcome, right? Okay, actually, no. So it's much more. So that the 75th percentile outcome, a top lineup is scoring 342 points. So a 300 fantasy point outing is actually probably something like a 60th percentile, right? Well, what that means is that it's only going to reach that particular point total or more 40% of the time, right? And I think this is a really important thing to remember, right? Is that, lineups, the top lineup for a given night, the optimal of a given night, or the lineup that banks the big contest, right? In a lot of ways is the lineup that was the furthest from its actual expectation, right? The lineup that misses the cash line by a mile actually has a lot in common with the lineup that banks the contest, because they are both very, very far from the most common outcome, or the middle outcome, right? They're in essentially, like, I often come on here and say that average projections, part of the reason average projections are not useful in DFS is because we want upside, and that average projections are not predictive of upside. But there is almost this like literal, by definition, component of this, that the lineup that is the most profitable to you is the lineup for which the average outcome you were the furthest away from the average outcome, the most likely outcome, the one where the average projections were the most wrong for that particular player. So I don't want to like ramble too much on this particular point, because I promise you I will, because this is the kind of thing that I think is very interesting about DFS. But like, anybody promising you that they're building lineups that are scoring 300 fantasy points nightly is straight up lying to you, and we can just know that that's the case, right? Because there is no lineup for which that is the projection. There is no lineup where that is a middle outcome, right? Because if it was, then it would be a particular slate where everybody had that lineup, right? Like, regardless of what you kind of think, regardless of whatever individual projections you're using for that particular slate, right? On a sport like NBA, a lot of the projections are going to kind of center around the same general plays, right? Nobody can build a lineup. I can pretty much guarantee you, nobody can build a lineup for tonight's slate that has a 50-50 shot even if we replayed this slate 10,000 times, of scoring 300 points. It is not possible. So, just an interesting question kind of about the I think the way that these probabilities kind of fit together here. Eric said Chipotle Addict might make lineups that score 300 nightly. I assure you, and that's kind of actually the point I'm making, right? Like I get that this is a joke, but that is actually kind of the literal point I am making, is that no one can. What the sharpest players are doing is they are building lineups that optimize to give them those profitable outcome possible when the lineup has a 1% outcome, right? It is increasing your chances of a lineup having a top 1% outcome by using players that are projected well, but also are correlated, and then making that lineup as profitable, finding the balance of making that lineup as profitable as possible by having low-owned plays in there, right, to capitalize on that outcome. But just probabilistically speaking, unless you have just like some enormous edge, you have this crazy hidden secret that nobody else has discovered about the way that you project NBA, or you just use like a bloated NBA projection model or something, right? No one is going to be able to build lineups for tonight's slate, for example, and be able to prove that they can build a lineup that scores on average 300 points, right? Because it isn't there. So I think it is a kind of you get the sense, if you're on DFS Twitter and you're watching and you're looking at screenshots or even just, more skilled cash game players or whatever, like there's this sense that, there are people that are out there that are building higher lineups, right? Or that are building, more effective lineups every single night. And that's not really the case. It's the sharpest players have figured out how to optimize for the 1% outcome. They are not building lineups that are scoring that are like unfairly positioned to score more on average. So anyway, let's keep it going. All right. Man, a lot of questions today. That's awesome. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to continue to kind of just keep going through the questions that have come in Slack, and then we'll get to the YouTube chat questions. This question is from Underrated here. And he said, I know it's been covered, but I'm struggling with late swap. How should I adjust the sliders with late swap as the night goes on? I was looking for the video where this was covered, but could not find it. I will send you a link to a stream where I covered that in more detail with the timestamp, because there's been streams where I've covered this in quite a bit of detail. I'll give you the kind of short version of this. I would say most of the time I don't touch the sliders at all. If I am there, the main situations where I'll do the sliders is if I'm having a very good night, right? If I'm doing very well as the night goes on, I will turn ownership fade and sim variance down. If there is a night where there is huge news that is broken after the slate has locked, right? Like significant, a starter getting ruled out or a big name player getting ruled out, the top value plays of the slate have changed significantly. I will turn variance and ownership fade down so that I can just maximize my ability to swap optimally for that news. And then the last situation, I guess, is the opposite of the first one, is if I'm having just an awful night, right? Like a total donation night, I will often turn sim variance or ownership fade up in my last couple swaps of the night to try to win back some min cash equity, right? At that point, I'm losing anyway. Give me the 1% owned guy that if he goes off, maybe I min cash a few lineups. That's it. And that's the short answer. I've covered this in more detail in the past, so I will send you a link of one of those videos here. And then question from GEN here. He said, good afternoon. I have a few questions. Although the min salary is set, does it hurt if I change it from 59.5 to 5,700? My second question is, when doing my final build, is it best to leave the pool on its default, or should I just do 1,500 pool size going forward? First question about the min salary. I don't think you stand to lose much by dropping your min salary down, right? Because at the end of the day, we're not optimizing for average projection, right? We're using simulations to back up each individual lineup. So if you build a lineup where your salary is 48,000 or something like that, right? What it means is that there's a set of simulations where the 48,000 salary lineup is optimal. And to me, that's a good enough reason to use a lineup. Now, the reason we don't have min salary set at 0 by default is that especially as your sim variance goes up, you can take risk, right? You can take unnecessary risk as this min salary gets lower and lower, right? Like you may not, especially when we're talking about if you're using sim variance 10, right? You're using single game simulations to build your lineup. Well, there's almost certainly lineups that are at 44,000 salary that are optimal for at least one set of sim, but you don't need to take that amount of risk to play the contest you're playing. So short answer here is that, yeah, no, if you told me that you don't want to play lineups at just at 49.5, you want to leave this open to 47 or 49 or whatever it is for you, I say that's perfectly fine. I would say approach with caution if you, the higher your sim variance slider is, right? And I would typically, when I'm late, if I'm late swapping and I'm getting errors, I will often turn this to 0. But in general, beyond that, I typically don't ever go below 3,000 below the max salary. That's like my personal base. Actually, no, that's not even true, because like showdown slates and baseball showdowns and things like that, I definitely drop it down. I don't think there's anything wrong with dropping this down if you want to include a little bit more salary range in there, because the fact that we're using simulations to build the lineups kind of helps prevent a situation from just building a really bad low salary lineup. And then the follow-up question was, if you're doing your final build, is it best to leave the pool on the default, or should I just do 1,500 pool size going forward? I would say if you are building 150 or more lineups, I would increase this pool size. Maybe even like 100 lineups or more, I would increase it. I personally like when the pool size is at least 10x whatever the number of lineups I'm playing is. So at 150, that's 1,500, and that's the maximum. If you're playing 300 lineups, unique lineups, at that point, you just have to live with having a 1,500 pool. But I like to know that the pool size is at least 10x. What that means is that each lineup that you're building, we had 10 tries to get it right. We're picking between the 10. We're picking our favorite of 10. So anyway, I mean, like, short answer to that particular question is you can increase it if you want. I don't think it adds a ton of value. But I would, if you are playing, more than 100 or so, I guess technically more than 50, that's when I would start to think about increasing it. So, and then a question from Stanley here about contest selection. In contest selection, I know it's recommended to enter a contest with over 1,000 entrants. On today's $1 micro mini, the effective entrance is about 800. Would you recommend that over the 4-point play, because sharks cannot enter the $1 micro mini? This is where it gets interesting. There's not a perfect answer to this, to be completely honest. You're thinking about it the right way. Yeah, the advantage to the $1 150 max is that it's under $3. So the pool of available players to play that contest is smaller, right? And you are left with generally a less sharp group, right? The $4 has more players, right? More effective entrants, right? But a sharper pool of players is available to play that contest. For what it's worth, I'm entered in the $150 $1. I'm not entered in the $4 20 max. I don't know that I would say it is a fact that one of these contests is better than the others to play. I think this is where contest selection kind of gets interesting. It gets interesting quickly because a lot of times you have to make trade-offs with your contests. For me, the reason I am playing the 150 max really is that I am already playing other 20 max contests, right? I don't need actually, let me think of a better way to put this. To me, the tiebreaker is ultimately that I can get more lineups in play in the mini-max, even if you just match the money equally, right? You could have $80 in play in the mini-max and $80 in play in the $4, but only have 20 lineups in the $4 and 80 in the mini-max, right? So that ability to get more lineups in play to smooth out your variance in that way is enough of a tiebreaker for me to play that one instead of the $4. I think as a very good rule of thumb, if you are torn between two contests that seem very similar, right? The contest at the lower stakes that you can generally get more lineups in play for, I would say is probably the better option. But It's not always necessarily true that like there's just a very clear cut flow chart you can follow about the best contest to play. We do the best we can to kind of give you that in these videos on our YouTube channel, right? But inevitably you're going to run up against these situations, especially when you have to choose, right? So, okay, tough question here from a meme. I'm going to answer this the best I can. This one's kind of tricky, I think. But he said, can SaberSim be used to estimate efficient ownership in a specific contest in NHL? Assuming no rake, the ownership slider was set to neutral, and a distribution of projections was perfect. It would give 1,000 neutral EV lineups in a 1,000 entry contest. Any additional lineups would be negative EV. If this gets you close, where would the variance and correlation sliders be set? This is kind of a tough question for me. I'm going to answer this first, just like the very first sentence here. Can SaberSim be used to estimate efficient ownership in a specific contest in NHL? I don't even think this has to just be NHL, right? I think this can be like any sport. I think yes. The short answer is yes, it can be. And the way that you essentially do that, right, or try to do that is by turning ownership fade off, right? I would actually argue turning correlation off, right? And basically determining how often does a player show up in the optimal lineup for a particular slate, which if you were doing it from that direction, right, the optimal lineup, right, that would be sim variance 10. So your sliders would look like this, right? Building lineups like this would essentially give you 1,500 different slate simulations and show you the exposure of how often each player shows up in the optimal lineup for 1,500 sims, right? Now, that could be compared, that could essentially be an optimal ownership, and that could be compared to the projected ownership, and you could kind of come up with leverage. I do this. This is like literally part of my process for baseball and football, right? I think there's a couple assumptions that are important here. And in certain sports or certain situations, these assumptions break down. The first and the most important assumption here is basically saying that the percent chance of a player to show up in the mathematical optimal of a slate is close to the percent chance of that player showing up in the winning lineup, right? The bigger your contest, the higher your sim variance slider is by default, the better an assumption I think that is. But the lower variance the sport is and the smaller the contest is, right? The less the assumption is that the percent chance of players showing up in the optimal lineup is the percent chance of a player showing up in the winning lineup of a specific contest, the less that assumption works. I think you can counteract that a little bit by running a similar build where you pull down your sim variance, but then you get into a weird situation where you are bucketing groups of simulations together, right? There is something unique and special about sim variance 10 that you lose as soon as you bucket any simulations together, which is what happens as you move down to 0. So I guess on this particular point, this very first question here, yes, I think this can be done. I think it is best done at sliders 0, 0, 10. And mostly in sports where this assumption holds up, right? I don't like to do this. I guess the one other thing, I don't like to do this actually in NBA much because NBA is a lower variance sport. I think that assumption is worse, but also because there's so much news that breaks throughout the slate that your research that you've done beforehand in terms of determining efficient ownership falls out the window or gets thrown out the window as soon as a big name player gets scratched halfway through the slate. But I know you were asking about NHL, so I know I think it does work well in NHL. We're getting into the weeds a little bit here of this question about assuming no rake, ownership fade slider set to neutral, distribution of projections is perfect. Would it give 1,000 neutral EV lineups in a 1,000 entry contest? My gut feeling is telling me no, because there is still a distribution of there is still a range of outcomes for a particular lineup, right? Even if you build lineups with a 0 ownership fade, even 0 correlation, and 0 correlation, 0 ownership fade, and 10 sim variance, there is a spectrum of expected value of those lineups because there's a spectrum of scoring of what those lineups actually scored in the individual sims they represent. So there is still theoretically in kind of an EV curve there of lineups that are lower, assuming you're pitting these 1,000 lineups against themselves and all in the same contest, right? Some lineups, and even if you repeated this process thousands of times, some lineups are going to perform better than others. So I think this is one of those questions where at this point it would help me to know what your practical application is here, or at least something, because I think I very much have the sense that this is not just a theoretical curiosity for you, that there's something that you're interested in kind of doing here. That might help me along the way. Because I think at this point, I get a little confused, but that's how I'm like reading the question as it is. This point about any additional lineups would be negative EV. Any additional lineups inherently at that point would be negative EV because of the size of the prize pool, right? Like, I guess, I mean, assuming like every lineup beyond lineup 1,000 in a 1,000 entry contest is by definition negative EV. But I think I'm a little lost. So anyway, maybe a little more color on kind of like what you're looking for here, or if that was helpful, if I'm on the right track, let me know. We can come back to that. But for now, let's keep it going here. Okay. So this question says, when you say there's sim variance built into the minutes projection, how does that correlate to sim variance when doing a build? Say a player in step 1 is projected for 30 minutes. Am I going to get that 30-minute average in my sim selection when I build as well, or will it adjust based on the number of selection of sims used to create my build? A player is not locked into playing their exact average number of minutes in every single sim we have. So if you are, and you are subject to as much variance in your minutes as you are to your projection based on how high your sim variance setting is. If you are building lineups at sim variance 10, which means you have a single game simulation for every single lineup you're building, right? That means you could get a sim where Clint Capella plays 36 minutes, right? Maybe it's an overtime sim or double overtime sim, right? That can happen. That because you are, in that way, by putting your sim variance at 10, you are allowing that much variance into your process, right? And the lower your sim variance slider is, the less variance in both the minutes and projection there's going to be in your lineups, because even if you kind of pull outlier simulations in for that particular lineup, it's going to get drowned out by a much larger pool of simulations that are much closer to the mean or the median average. So how does that correlate to sim? It correlates essentially in the same way. I don't even know if like correlation is necessarily the right word there. It is because they are actual play-by-play simulations, right? Like at the end of one simulation of any one game, we have a result. We have a fantasy point total that player scored and a set of minutes that player played in that sim. So, and then you are subject to the same amount of variance based on your sim variance slider in both your minutes and your fantasy point projections. Okay, and then let's see. Gen asks a question here about my player pool curation. It says, when you look to remove players / trim the fat, is that based off the 75th percentile or the 95th percentile? Specifically for my process, when I have talked about doing this in the past, I use the 95th percentile because I think it's a convenient number to kind of say a player has a 5% chance or less to meet or exceed this number. Right. That's not to say that's just the only right way to do that. That is just kind of in my head, the way that I like to do this on a typical NBA slate tonight. If you were kind of taking this approach, I would say somewhere around 30 makes sense to me. If you wanted to do a little bit of additional player pool curation, I would like to know that on an 11-game NBA slate, on one where there projects to be a lot of value, that any min salary players that I'm rostering have at a baseline a 5% chance to 10x, right? That's kind of where this comes from, because their opportunity cost of being in the lineup and scoring less than 30 raw fantasy points is too high compared to other players that have a much higher raw chance of scoring 35, 36, 40, 50, 60 fantasy points, right? The other way of looking at this is that once the slate locks, the salary of a player doesn't matter, right? Your 8 need to beat anybody else's 8 in the contest. Can you spend a roster spot on Tyus Jones, who, even though he projects well point per dollar, only scores when he hits his 95th percentile outcome, still has only scored 27 points, right? I would argue probably not, right? Maybe you luck box into his 99th percentile outcome, or maybe the projections are just wrong, or maybe he plays 24 minutes, but odds are that there are better ways to use that roster spot. So that's like where it comes from for me. But again, this is just one way that I do a little bit of player pool curation. The answer to this question is not, it is 95th percentile, and this is the right way to do it. It is just the way that I have kind of thought about this or reasoned this out for me. So, okay, cool. And then another question here in Slack. This is a fun stream, guys. Thank you for all the questions. I promise we will get to everything. I know it's a little bit of a longer stream here, so if you're waiting for your question to get answered, I promise we'll get to everything. Hopefully, I'm keeping it interesting as we're working through some of the other questions here. This one says, if you're playing multiple contests, say a 150, 20 max, and maybe a 3 max, all with different maximum entrants and therefore different slider settings, is it more effective to build 173 lines and distribute accordingly, or is it better to have 3 individual builds tailored to each contest? If the latter, do you have advice on how to manage late swap a little better? Currently, I build each individually, but late swap can get hectic at times. But just curious if there's a smarter way to go about it, rather than perhaps limiting my contest selection. I think in NBA, I would just build them together. That's what I do. Use a set of sliders that is, roughly in between them all. You are not going to sacrifice very much expected value by having kind of a midpoint slider selection, right? I think the 20 max 10 to 50K are a very good kind of baseline set of sliders, right? It is not going to have a meaningful impact on your expected value of your lineups to use this and build unique lineups and do 173 lineups all in one build. You also have the nice part of being able to manage all of your exposures all in one place. I think it's a great way to do this. And it's the best advice I can give for solving this problem. I think if you want to optimize and use the perfectly right sliders for every single contest that you're playing and do these different builds, it is the cost of that you have 3 different builds to manage when you're late swapping and editing exposures and things like that. So if you told me that there were extreme differences between the sliders in your contests, right? Maybe it doesn't make sense to use the exact same build to build a 100-man single entry as it does to build lineups for the 150 max, like something like this. At that point, maybe it makes a little more sense to do that. But I like personally here, let me show you like what I'm playing tonight. Okay, there's a pretty big spectrum of contests in here, right? The daily dollar is like 5K entrance. Some of these very small winner take alls and like this one are like very small contests. And then I have like the big mini max. I will be building all of these lineups together. The way I typically do this is that I like to take the contest that I am the most financially invested in and use those sliders. I will almost certainly be using a set of sliders that is either this. I may consider using this. Just because I think a very high sim variance in NBA a lot of times isn't super necessary. And I will be using this to fill all of my entries I'm playing tonight. Because to me, it is just, I would rather have lineups in single entry contests that are a little higher variance, that are a little more ownership faded than theoretically optimal for the ability to build all of my lineups together and late swap everything together. Because I've mentioned this countless times. The single most important thing to my NBA process is late swap. I think it is by far the biggest edge you can get. So I want to make that as easy and efficient as possible. Virtually everything I do in my NBA DFS process is to facilitate late swap. So that's my approach. But okay, cool. Let's see. So there was a follow-up question here from a meme as well. Let's see. Just wanted to find the best way to use SaberSim to estimate efficient ownership. So that answer helped a lot. The rest was theoretical. Also, would increasing min uniques in this method help or hurt the efficient ownership percentage predicted? I think it would hurt it because you are going to prevent the builder from showing you what the optimal is for a particular simulation because of that restriction, right? Like a certain player may need, like you may have two sims or two slate simulations for which the optimal is actually extremely similar, and there is just one player different, but because you've set a minimum uniques number there, it has to use the next best player, which would artificially change the actual efficient ownership of those players. So I would leave min uniques at 1. I actually think there is a mathematically correct argument to be made that min uniques should actually be 0 if you were doing a mathematically correct evaluation here, because the same lineup could technically be optimal for 2 unique slate simulations, and if it were, that should be represented in the data. There unfortunately is no way to do that right now. You have to kind of take that as a source of error there. We are not going to add min uniques 0 to our builder because we do not want to unleash chaos. But theoretically, you would actually want that at 0 if you were to do that. So, and then a question about the test build from GEN. It is 0010, or the research build, right? I want to kind of be clear. When you're doing this research build to approximate the percent chance a player is optimal, right? It should be 0010 because you're using single game simulations to sim the slate out, right? And again, for everybody that's watching that maybe is unfamiliar with this, I call this a research build because it is purely for research. I am by no means saying build lineups like this and enter them into contests. This is just a way of visualizing the percent chance of a player showing up in the optimal lineup, right? When I build my actual lineups, I use the sliders that are optimized for that contest. But if you built lineups here, you would basically just be building cash lineups. This is the highest average projected lineups that you can build, rather than the highest projected lineups you could build for individual sims. So. Okay, I see there are some other questions that are coming in Slack, but I'm almost answering questions in real time in Slack here now. So I'm actually going to jump over to YouTube chat and get to all the YouTube guys here and make sure we answer these. So Kent, thank you so much for being patient. He said, I don't worry too much about this in NBA, but was curious the best way to make the optimizer focus on having a run back from the opposing team in a certain situation. For example, yesterday, if I had Giannis in my lineup, I wanted to have at least 2 Pacers. Same thing. If I had 3 Pacers, I wanted to have Giannis or at least one of the good Bucks in that lineup. There's not a super easy way to do this in NBA at the moment because we don't have the advanced stacking rule set up for NBA. So I'll show you, and you're probably familiar in football, right? So in football, we have this advanced stacking rule. Give this a second here. So we have this advanced stacking rule here where you can basically say exactly that. So you can say that, I don't know, for a particular team, if a team is stacked, you want the run back there, right? We have the new groups functionality. Well, actually, before I get ahead of myself, our goal is to roll out those advanced stacks to other sports as well. So that is coming. Right now, we have the new groups functionality, but you can't set a conditional group. So that's something that we're kind of maybe talking about adding in the future based on if people seem to want it, which we have had the indication from people that this is something that you guys would want. I'm trying to think about if there's kind of a sneaky way to do this for now. Here's what I would do. I would use our new filters rule. So let's go back to yesterday. And the filters rule, it allows you to kind of make sure that this happens, but it does so by stripping away big chunks of your lineups that don't fit a certain rule. So here's what I would do. I would build, and if you knew you wanted to do something like this, first of all, I would build with a higher pool size to give yourself more lineups to allow this to happen, right? And then what I would do here is I would say, start new build. And then what we can do is after the lineups get built, we can eliminate the lineups that don't match what you want here. So let's see. If you have Giannis, you want at least 2 pacers. So we'll do that one first. And then if you have 3 pacers, you have to have a Bucks. You have to have a Bucks player. So we can do both of these. I'll show you how we do this. Okay, so let's make a couple projection changes real quick just so we can see the lineups. Okay. So we have 100% Giannis. So what we're first going to do is we're going to say, show me all the lineups that have Giannis, right? And then what we need is we need to make sure every single one of these has a Pacers stack in it, right? That at least has 2 Pacers in it. So we can see 80% of them do. But we can go here and say, show me the lineups that have Giannis that don't have at least 2 Pacers in it. And then we can go to the pool tab and we can say remove filter lineup. So I'm going to trash. So this is why I said build yourself a big pool, because we are now going to trash almost 600 lineups from our pool here that have Giannis that don't have a pacer, that don't have 2 Pacers in it. But we're going to say, yes, I confirm. Right? And now let's fill. And we clear the filters. Okay. So now we still have 100% Giannis, but we also have 100% Pacer stacks. In this particular sense, I actually think we fixed it because we have 100% Giannis and 100% Pacers. But let's just say the other way around you said this was that any lineup that I guess the proper way of doing this would be to say, show me all lineups that have 3 Pacers. Now show me all lineups that have 3 Pacers that don't have Giannis. Right? There aren't any in our top 20, but there are some in our pool. So now we could also say remove the additional 40 that have 3 Pacers with no Giannis. And now we're in business. So again, it's worth noting that to find 20 lineups, we had to throw away almost 600, but it's okay because we have 1,500 to work with. But the more and more changes you do like this, the more and more you potentially are set up to, what am I trying to say? Sorry, I got distracted by seeing that weird filter thing. The more changes you want to do this way, the more and more you are stripping off chunks of your pool size. So I think it makes sense to build yourself a nice big pool size from which to work with. But this is the easiest way to do that at the moment. Obviously, this is a very this is like something that you do after the build rather than telling us beforehand that you want it this way. So we do want to add more control in the future so that you can just come in and say, no, I want the lineups to look this way in the first place. So you don't have to like throw away chunks of lineups, but this is the easiest way to do it for now. So Kent, I hope you're still here. I'm sorry again that it took so long for me to get to that question, because I think that at least in theory is probably exactly what you're trying to do. And I think that'd be pretty helpful, but anyway, let's see. Raul said, first off, SaberSim's legit. My scores have been higher, but why do lower SaberScore lineups produce better lineups? SaberScore is our attempt to quantify the expected value of a lineup, meaning that one lineup would be the most profitable over the long term if we played out this slate 10,000 times. It does not mean that is the highest scoring lineup on average, right? And it does not mean that you are going to realize that highest expected value on every individual given slate. So it's very likely that your top overall scoring lineup on the given slate is not your highest Saber scoring lineup, or even maybe not even your top 100 highest Saber scoring lineup, because your top 10 highest Saber scoring lineups is 10 lineups, and your entire pool may have 1,500 lineups in them. Now, we've done extensive back testing on our models and believe that SaberScore is predictive of what lineups have the highest expected value over the long term. But on any given night, it's entirely possible that any lineup of your pool could be your highest scoring lineup. So SaberScore should essentially be thought of as a tiebreaker. After you have gone in and put your whatever you do in step 1 or 2, you've built your lineups and you've adjusted your exposures in step 3. SaberScore is a very strong tiebreaker to say, okay, we know everything you want to do with your lineups. These are the best 20 or 150 to play with, right? But it is not the end all be all. I don't think, unless you don't want to make any changes independently of SaberScore, right? Unless you like build your lineups and you're happy with the exposures, right? I don't think, I would never stop someone from making adjustments to their exposures in step 3 because they're worried about sacrificing SaberScore, right? Let SaberScore ultimately be a tiebreaker to determine what lineups to play in your contests once you've made all your other adjustments. So, Eric said, do you guys have an annual plan for pricing? We do. You can email us, support@sabersim.com. And we'll get you there. B Swifty said, do I find it easier? Maybe, do I? Or do you? Do I find it easier to find contrarian value or stud plays on bigger slates like tonight? Obviously, things change if one specific team has a drastic roster change. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the more teams on the slate there are, the more likely there is to be good value because there's more players in the pool. So, yeah, I mean, typically on, an 11-game slate like tonight, there's going to be a ton of value, almost certainly, just because there's 11 teams, right? Like one or two or three of these teams are going to have players out, leading to a lot of value. So, yeah, I think it's easier. Contrarian value, even it's easy to find contrarian value too, because there's just purely more value, right? So, I mean, again, ownership projections will dial in as the day goes on, but if these 3 plays are sub 10% owned and they're essentially all in the same value band as all these other guys, then there's your contrarian value. So, oh yeah, B50 said you. Yeah. So yeah, it cuts both ways. Like, there's more value. There's better projected plays. It is by definition easier to find. I keep saying that's my trendy thing today. I feel like every once in a while I get on a trendy word or phrase and I just say it all the time. Right now it's by definition. I don't even know if I'm using it correctly in all these cases, but it is easier to find contrarian value because there is simply more value. But the other flip side of that is that the ownership spreads out naturally the more players there are on a slate. So you get less of an ownership edge by differentiating yourself. Right? If this was a 4-game slate, Aaron Wiggins might be 60% owned, right? Well, then the fade has that much more relative edge, right? On a night like tonight, if he's 25% owned, yeah, you can fade him, but you've only faded 25% of the field. So, goes both ways. But Nightmare says, is FanDuel more about winning each combined position? In general, I don't think about DFS in this way at all. Ultimately, we're not playing players, we're playing lineups. So it is not about winning the position battle, right? You're not trying to play the best center. You're trying to play the best lineup. And I know I think most people kind of just get that as they hear it. And they're like, yeah, no, I get it. I need to have the highest lineup. But I think the more you can internalize that and actually make that a part of your process, right? There really aren't, within reason, there aren't bad plays and good plays in DFS, right? All players have a spot that they can fill in a given lineup, generally speaking, right? You can validate that purely by building, 1,500 lineups or something just to test it out and look how many players show up in your player pool, right? That is basically saying that there are, any player that is exposed in your player pool in a 1,500 lineup build. Essentially, the builder is saying this player has a role to fill in at least some set of game simulations for this game, which means there's generally a much wider pool of players that actually has viability than people like to think. And it all comes down to how they are combined with other players in a given lineup. So In general, I would say no, not just FanDuel, but in general, DFS is not about winning certain positions or being right on certain players. It is about building high upside lineups. So Eric said, you or someone else said Saber is good for shorter slates. How do you make it just as good for a slate this size? I don't think it's worse. I think the main thing is that, when the sim variance slider is high by default, right? When you have a very high sim variance slider, you are relying more on simulations rather than average projections. And our simulations, I think, was one of our biggest differentiators. It is not our only differentiator, but it is one of our biggest differentiators. The reason why is because average projections are somewhat accessible, right? Especially in a sport like NBA. We have, based on our backtesting, literally the best average projections for NBA in the industry. But it's pretty easy to build pretty good average projections. And the more they are valuable, in other words, the more the optimal value for this slider is 0 or closer to 0, the less the sims have an impact, right? So as you get down into here, right, I would actually argue that your edge in a 500-person single entry contest is likely to be a little bit lower because the sims don't really mean a lot at that level, right? You could probably get by just using the average projections. So the higher the sim variance slider is, the more we have an edge. Now, a couple things to note on that. It does not mean the edge just disappears in a situation where your sim variance is 5, right? There is, while on a larger slate, the average projections are more valuable, there's also far more information to parse. And notice, like, our correlation slider starts to come up here. Our ownership fade slider is up. So you have a builder here that's processing correlations of players, the ownership of players, and still some variance of simulations to build optimal lineups. So the edge is not disappearing. The edge doesn't disappear, but I think it comes down a little bit when the sim variance slider comes down. Now, I think, interestingly, one of the greatest ways to continue to maintain an edge or to make your edge as big as possible on bigger slates is to think about, how can I target contests where it is optimal to play in a way further away from single game simulation or from single game simulations, right? Or from average projections, sorry. How can I play in a way, right, where the optimal strategy is to avoid average projections and to prioritize simulations, right? Right? Anyone have any thoughts on that? I guess the problem, I'm not really truly, like, I don't see the questions in here coming in truly live. Like, I think there's a little bit of a couple seconds delay, so I can't really do the quiz game here. But the answer, the one that pops into my head, is actually by increasing the size of your contests, by going out and playing the biggest contest you can find on a slate like this, you can, I think, add some of your edge back in, right? Because the people that are approaching those contests, giant 150 max 50K entry type plays, are going to inefficiently build with their average projections. Whereas if you're sticking down here, they can succeed more easily, right? Well, no, they don't have the nice factors of correlation, right? They still don't have the other things that we offer. But if you want to maximize the impact that the simulations have, try to find contests where it is to your benefit to rely on them more heavily. And it doesn't, you can vary your slate up too, right? There's a 11 game slate tonight. Well, you know what slate has pretty good contests? That's not the big main one, is this one, the night slate, right? The 2 game slate, you are almost always going to be incentivized to rely very heavily on single game simulations rather than average projections. And this slate, I've already entered for it, has great contests, right? So, but good question. And again, that is not to say that SaberSim cannot succeed at big slates, right? On an 11-game slate with a 500 NBA player pool, or 200, or however many it is, there's still a ton of information to parse. There's still correlations that come through in these games, right? There's still a lot of valuable information that a traditional tool that is just optimizing for average projections is not going to pick up well on. So, but do you think there's an interesting idea of target your contest selection where you can make your sims the most valuable to you? And that would be in the largest contest possible. So, David says, there are times when I have to make a decision on sliders and late swap. If I play a 150 piggy bank along with some 20 max or singles, I'll usually do a separate build from the 150 and change sliders at late swap. That's true, and that's fine. I like to just late swap everything together. I will happily opt into more ownership fade and more variance than less. So I will group my single entries with my 150 maxes and swap everything together on the higher settings most of the time, because I would rather look at a lineup at the end of the night and be like, wow, that lineup was over leveraged, had too little ownership than the other way around. I hate playing too chalky. It drives me crazy. When I look at a lineup at the end of the night and I'm like, this is a cash lineup, it bothers me. So, but okay, cool. Let's see. Kyle said, hey guys, killed it on the Super Bowl Sunday. So close to 100K. No joke. Got a share of fourth in the main daily dollar, $1,500. Congratulations. It's awesome. I know Showdown was very profitable for a lot of or Super Bowl Showdown was very profitable for a lot of our community here. So he said, this still killing the Showdowns almost on a daily basis. I'm following the 5% per slate plan you guys laid out and appears to be working very well. Yeah, that's awesome. I've been crushing NBA Showdown this season. These NBA Showdowns and short slates has been just amazing all season long for me. So highly recommend checking those out if you're not playing them already. But B Swifty said, if you're using one build for multiple entries, is it fine that you're entering duplicated lineups, or would you suggest getting the subscription where you can build more than 20 lineups at a time? Thanks. You almost never want to duplicate yourself within the same lineup, or within the same contest. Virtually never. If you're interested in seeing kind of like a proof why, I'd watch this video on a SaberSim YouTube all the way down at the bottom. Why is avoiding duplication important in DFS? It's a good little proof on a spreadsheet of why it's bad to dupe yourself. If you are on the starter plan where you are limited to 20 lineups maximum in a build, I would just play 20 maxes, right? It's fine to use the same set of 20 lineup in multiple different 20 maxes. You just don't want to use the same lineups in the same contest. If you want to play 150 max, you should be on the DFS advanced plan, right? That's basically what it comes down to. So if you're on the starter plan, totally fine. Stick to the 20 maxes. If you want to play 150 maxes, you should be on the advanced plan. So Dante says, hey, Jordan, while entering some 150 max contests with a handful of bullets, I found it successful to use the satellite sliders in massive contests versus GPP settings. Can this be another way to approach it? Yeah, absolutely. And the top heavier the payout structure is, the more you should be incentivized to use like higher and higher, or higher ownership fade and sim variance sliders, especially, right? Like if we compare these two, let's look at the 150 max stuff, right? Wait, why do these look different now? Oh, because we're on this, hang on, whoops. Okay, so yeah, comparing between the GPP and the satellite settings, right? Wait, it's driving me crazy. So let's assume you have two equivalent contests, 150 max over 50K, satellite versus GPP, right? A satellite is either going to have one ticket up top or a very, very, very condensed prize pool up top, right? A GPP is going to have a very top-heavy prize pool, right? Or is going to have a top-heavier prize pool, but there's still meaningful equity in the other payout positions. You're probably relatively satisfied in a GBP as long as you're finishing top 0.1% or top 0.5 or even top 1%. Whereas in a satellite, you literally need to come into first. So what these sliders are saying is that the more and more a satellite, or the more and more a GBP approaches a satellite type structure, the more you are incentivized in playing a higher ownership fade and sim variance setting. Right? The more top heavy your GPP is. So if you're playing if you're playing the fadeaway or whatever, right? That's typically 100K to first, 25K to second. I think 10th gets $1,000, right? So, okay. Oh, it's actually $12 today. It's kind of cool. It's a little cheaper, right? And it's actually not as top heavy, right? But it's still pretty top heavy, right? 100K. 10% of that is fourth, and then by 10th, you're 1% of the first prize, right? Pretty top-heavy contest, right? You are incentivized to play this contest more aggressively. So increasing your sim variance, increasing your ownership fade to match it as if it were more of a satellite, I think is a great idea. So, Kobe said, SaberSim got me on a 4-day run. Congrats. That's what's up. Showdown. You mean any single game contest? FanDuel. Yeah, sorry. I kind of speak a lot in DraftKings terms. For NFL, I don't like FanDuel at all. I don't play FanDuel single game on NFL because I think it's too easy to get duped, right? There's one MVP slot. You don't have to pay more to roster a player in the MVP slot. And there's only 5 total players in your lineup. So I think it's just too easy to get duped. It's hard to be profitable playing FanDuel NFL. That's just my take. But for basketball, I like their system a lot. So on DraftKings, you have one MVP, and you have to pay more to roster them at the MVP slot, and you have 6 total roster positions. On FanDuel for a single game, you don't have to pay more to roster a player at the multiplier positions, right? They're the same price no matter where you roster them, but there are 3 multiplier positions. So I think FanDuel for NBA in particular has a competitive product, and I like their single game offerings just as much as I like the DraftKings ones. But that's really only for basketball. I wish they would adopt this model for football as well, but they have not yet. So, okay, cool. And then there were a couple other questions here that had come in okay. Couple questions that had come in Slack. So good follow-up here. What is the best routine/strategy to get better at single game NBA DFS tournaments? I would watch this video first. In our NBA course, you don't have to be a pro to beat NBA showdowns. Hour-long, lesson of our NBA course about NBA showdowns. Highly recommend checking that out. Going to be able to go into more detail than I can right here, right now. With that said, I think, similar kind of conversations that we've had on the NFL side. I think to beat NBA Showdown, first of all, lean into the sims, right? That is what they are for. The challenges of NBA Showdowns or showdowns in general are figuring out what are the game scripts that are possible for this game? How can the game play out? And then from there, what are the optimal lineups that would come out of that particular game script? Well, SaberSim automates both of those for you. By simulating a game 10,000 times, we are covering an enormous percentage of the spectrum of actual outcomes that are possible for that game, right? And then by building the lineups that are based on those optimals, right? By simulating these games, we can build the DFS lineups that represent those optimals. So I think a huge portion of this comes from the fact that we have these game simulations. So take advantage of them. But I think then after that, some of the biggest ways that you can add some additional value there are to intentionally leverage against the field, identify what are the optimal lineups that the field is going to find easily, right? Or they are going to overinflate the percentage of those optimal lineups from happening. And what are the lineups then that are easier to, what are the lineups that the field is going to undervalue, right? I also think it's worth spending a little bit of time, especially when you're playing bigger contests, to look at duplication, right? You don't want to you don't want to get duped if you can avoid it. So making adjustments to maximum salary, intentionally spot checking and picking lineups that maybe have a lower percent chance of being duped for one reason or another, right? Again, cover this in more detail in this video. But those are kind of the main things that I like to keep an eye on. So, all right. A meme said, is there a cheat sheet for slider settings for each sport based on slate size? If not, this would be helpful for a gut check. Sometimes the sliders don't reset when changing contest size / max entry tabs. As long as you are changing them, right? They should, right? Like if you go in here and click and stay on the same thing as you were, they won't change, but we don't have a cheat sheet mostly because they change, right? Like we kind of are constantly testing them. And they can change based on what we're finding in our back tests. They really should change though. So if you can reliably, maybe I don't even actually want to put that necessarily on you. If it's happening, right? If if you have a situation where the sliders aren't updating to the defaults, I think the easiest thing to do would be to, like, once it happens, to report a problem, so you can send a session recording to our devs so we can see what's going on. But they really should change. So, let's see. And then I think a couple questions here. All right, I'm going to hit this one first. This is from GEN, and then Ameem will look at some of these other questions here. You've got, let's see. And this one says, is the best time to late swap before each set of games starts? For example, 7:30, 8. Yeah, pretty much. You don't need a late swap if no news breaks, right? Or put it another way, right? Like, it's possible on a slate like tonight, probably not likely, but it's possible that at 5, we might have the news about these 5:30 games, right? So in a hypothetical world, which again, I don't think this is going to happen, but if all 8 of these teams have green check marks by them and all of their lineups are confirmed, all their starting lineups are confirmed, you may not need to late swap at 5:30. But otherwise, I typically late swap before each start of each game. So, and then, okay, a couple questions here. Just ran 0010 research builds for NHL large slates. The most efficient stack formats calculated are not the most commonly used 4-3, which is a quite low percentage of lineups. Does this suggest an edge by using various stack formats or need to increase correlation slider in research builds? What you are getting out of that research build is the mathematical optimal lineups. And in reality, the tool that correlation provides us allows us to find lineups that have a very high chance of being the highest lineups in a contest without necessarily having to be the highest mathematical optimals. There are so many players in the pool for NHL, and there are so many random third line, fourth line, second power play type plays that can score, 2 goals and be optimal or something like that in a single game simulation, that you actually find this is true of a lot of high correlation sports. If you do the same thing in baseball, right, you will see if you run a 0-0-10 build for a baseball slate, what you are going to get out of that is you are going to get generally almost very low, very, very unstacked lineups, because it is too easy to find an optimal set of 8 or 9 players of the random guys that hit multiple home runs that aren't correlated and stacked up with the rest of the guys on their team. Because even if the Yankees score 12 runs in that particular sim, so you have Stanton and Judge in the lineup, right? In a DFS contest, it might have been enough to win the contest to just stack the other 3 Yankees into that lineup. But in the actual optimal, the mathematical optimal, it was easier to pick out 3 random other players that had high-performing nights in that set of sims. So in terms of, like, should you increase correlation slider, I think it depends on what you are trying to do. When I do research builds, I am purely looking at player exposures. I don't really care what the lineups look like. I just want to know the percent chance that a player shows up in the optimal lineups. I'll handle the stacks later, right? Like, I want to know, is the field overvaluing Nathan McKinnon, right? I will handle whether I'm going to use Avs stacks or not. I want to know if the field is overvaluing this particular skater, right? Or in the case of baseball, hitter, right? Because it often follows that, if the best overall plays on a given team are overvalued, the stack is also overvalued, and you don't need the research build to tell you that. But if you want your research build to have stacks, what I would actually recommend is, rather than increasing the correlation slider, I would set a stacking rule. So I would use a 0-0-10 build, but set a stacking rule, right? Because when you introduce the correlation slider, you are going to kind of weirdly change the factor that is used to determine whether or not a player gets put into the lineup is going to change because of that value of the correlation slider. The stacking rule instead is going to kind of, in a more pure way, just force constructions. So if you want to research stacks, I would set the stacking rule, but still use the 0-0-10 build. Now, at that point, you need to be cautious of, you can really only use a research build to research stacks or players, but not both. Because at that point, let's go back, let me pull up the NHL slate real quick. So you may artificially be led to believe that multiple players from the same team are all equally overowned because you set a stacking rule, when in reality, maybe there's one or two particular players that are overowned. So if you have decided I'm going to research stacks, I would build a research bill to research stacks, but from there, not try to draw any conclusions about players, and vice versa. If you run a research build intended to research players, I would not use it for stacks. So a meme said, good stuff. Maybe I'll ask a question one day that stumps you. I bet you will. But no, this is fun. I love the research build stuff. This stuff feels very kind of personal to my process. So I always love talking about this kind of stuff. But HC said, hey, Jordan, just wanted to say after your SaberSim video suggestions yesterday, I was able to cash in all my single entry contests. Thanks. Congratulations. That's awesome. Happy to hear that. So, all right. Hour and 35 minutes. You guys are awesome. Thank you for hanging out with me here today. We're going to go ahead and stop it right there. That was a fun stream. I don't even want to summarize it because we talked about all kinds of stuff. We went all over the place. That was a blast. Remember, tomorrow we'll be back, but it's 3 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, 1 hour later than normal. Not the 2 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Eastern. We're talking NASCAR DFS. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I think, built 3 NASCAR DFS lineups in my history. I had no idea what I was doing. I won tickets. And I just hand built them. But our NASCAR simulator is coming out this weekend for Daytona. And I'm going to be talking to one of our NASCAR experts in our community tomorrow, live on stream here, picking his brain, learning how to play this sport in preparation for Daytona and the rest of the NASCAR season kicking off this weekend. So super excited about that. That will, again, be live tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern. So if you have questions about how to beat NASCAR DFS, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack. Email us, support@sabersim.com. We'll talk about them on stream tomorrow. On Friday, I am hoping that we can do another NASCAR stream, this time bringing on the guys that built the simulator, Max, Will, Eric, and having them come on and talk to me a little bit about how our actual sim works for the sport. We will follow this up by probably sometime next week, putting out kind of a shorter video, 15, 20 minutes, just onto the YouTube channel. Won't be a live stream or anything like that. That will be kind of like your how to beat NASCAR DFS getting started guide, based on kind of what I've learned and what we've learned over the course of building the model out and getting ready for the season. So anyway, a lot to look forward to there. I guess that will do it here for today. Yeah, until then, good luck. Enjoy tonight's slates, and see you guys tomorrow.